Time to get serious. It's at least a double entendre. I'm Josh Corman. I'm the founder of IamTheCavalry.org. It's a nonprofit focused on where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. We turned 10 years old last year. We'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute.
I'm David Etchew. My current roles, I'm a fellow at the National Security Institute, so a volunteer at the George Mason University think tank. I'm also a former cybersecurity CEO that's thinking about what's next. So we're both here as volunteers to talk about a really, really important topic.
A couple of years ago, I did get a score for failing to avoid commercialization. I'm just reminding you, we both flew ourselves out here on our own dimes. We have no company. These are nonprofits. Please don't break my soul. Okay. We're gonna go fast. It's gonna come hard. It's gonna be more than you wanna hear. It's gonna be more than you're comfortable with, and that's by design. And today is not the entire experience. Today is the talk. We didn't even want to necessarily do this talk. We have a workshop tomorrow where we can dig in and just debate and discuss. But we're gonna blitzkrieg you with some things that people aren't paying attention to, that need to provoke thought. We want to inform you, inspire you, influence you, but really we want to make sure that we always think we have more time than we do. And you're going to find that is the case with this subject matter. You may not decide that today. You might decide that a year from now. You might decide that 2 years from now. But we have less time than we think, and we're going to try to respect you enough to tell you what we believe to be hard truths right down the middle. The harder the truth, the more forthright you need to be. And that means there's two types of failures. Downplaying it is a failure and exaggerating it is a failure. We're gonna do neither, but we're gonna come at you hard, and we want you to be uncomfortable because that is exactly how you should feel. So we're gonna touch a little bit about how this conference is mostly about private goods, your local enterprise risk, your job, but there's also public goods at risk, and we're doing a bad job with those. We're gonna give you a sample rate of the existence proofs to date of how serious things have gotten. There are wars and rumors of wars. Perhaps you've heard some even this week. And then we're going to show that we are still hopeful, right? Necessity is the mother of invention. So we have a couple concrete examples, especially when I ran the CISA COVID task force during the pandemic, where you don't have as much time as you want. You don't have as much resources as you want. You can still get stuff done. So we remain belligerent in the face of adversity. And then we're going to try to make sure that even if you only came for your day job, there's some key assumptions we need to smash if we find ourselves in the wake of hybrid conflict on US soil, which we have very high probabilities of seeing. And the double entendre here is not only have things gotten serious, it's time for some of us to get serious too. And if this really strikes a chord in your heart, there's a Wednesday opportunity to get involved with some national security people, current and former.
And I think we'll wrap that apply because beyond inspiring you, we want you to take tools home with you to actually, whether for your personal good, your company or enterprise's good, or societal good, that you can walk out here with actions you can take versus just inspiration.
Right. Quick show of hands. Anybody familiar with IamTheCavalry.org? Okay. The idea is the cavalry isn't coming. We were born 10 years ago on August 1st at the HackerCons. David and I were part of a group that went into Fort Meade, warned of certain things we were concerned about. We thought things like anonymous and hacktivism may turn into cyber terrorism, and it did. Kid from UK, honor student, Team Poison, got arrested for hacking Tony Blair's website, and while in prison, radicalized, joined ISIS, moved his wife and child to Raqqa, Syria, and started the cyber caliphate, coordinating attacks on US soil, like the girl in Texas shootings. Was ultimately killed by a drone strike. So we started realizing that when you add software and connectivity to everything, you make it exposed to accidents and adversaries. And 11 years ago, we were speaking truth to power at Fort Meade for a couple days. You'll have a picture of some of the others. But at the end of those 2 days, when we had our profound recommendations to really novel new ideas to keep Americans safe, they said, we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't do that. And at the bar, at the airport, I said to the guys after a long period of silence, the cavalry isn't coming. No one's gonna fix this for us. And then after some personal tragedies at the hacker convention, I realized that if no one's coming to save you, it's both overwhelming and empowering, because then it falls to you. You have to ask, what are you willing and able to do? So we asked the hackers, and many answered that call. But the general thrust from day one was that we're over-dependent on undependable things. And through that over-dependence, that we expose ourselves to accidents and adversaries, and it can have a pretty profound impact. We usually say it's where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood.
Again, this is not a doomsday talk. We're going to talk about a lot of things that are really uncomfortable and not a lot of fun. And when you put them together and look at the bigger picture, it's discomforting. But this is about inspiration. that, like we were chatting with someone before this, who's like, man, I just want to move to the mountains and like get off the network. And like, again, if you want to do that, like, great. That's what we're here to inspire you to do. We're here to inspire you to look at these problems and figure out as an individual, as an organization, as a society, how we address these things.
Yeah. So we're going to start with how things are getting pretty serious. Maybe you've heard of some of these stories. Maybe you've heard all of them. Most of you have heard none of them. So we'll at least give you some ground truth. First thing, I'm a philosopher by training, but most people don't even understand the difference between public good and private good. Right? Free markets tend to work when, I'm not going to do economics 101 here, but a lot of you come here, this is a conference for the private good, right? It's for profit, it's people selling stuff to your enterprise, you're buying stuff for your enterprise, you're trying to solve for what's right for you. You look at the Colonial Pipeline hack, when they shut down things, that was to protect shareholder interest. So what was right for them was wrong for the Eastern Seaboard. So sometimes what's right for the private entity is wrong for the public good. And sometimes they come in tension, and that's why you have a public sector or government to look for when there are tensions there.
Yeah, so we have obviously the tragedy of the commons, and but I think one of the things that's fascinating about this problem set is that I think with the internet and connectivity is these are inherently connected. So I think the part that as we started with this talk that really struck me was what if my own and common are inherently connected? That if you're the CEO of a nuclear power plant, you don't worry about a fighter jet coming in and blowing up your plant. Like the government protects you from that. But in the cyber world, private sector capabilities impact global security. We'll talk about our posture with foreign nation states around how our resilience as private sector impacts our ability to drive different issues and topics in the public sector world. So these things are inherently connected in our world in a way that that we don't see in other areas, and I think our actions don't reflect that today, and that's I think one of the big changes we need to make. So that's what we're going to dig a lot into today.
And as you watch these high-profile attacks, we may touch on Change Healthcare more on Wednesday, but the actual damage to United Health Group and Change Healthcare was pretty small. Even the $22 million ransom isn't that bad. Even getting screamed at by Congress all day last week isn't that bad. The amount of harm to the country, to the nation's pharmacies, small, medium rural hospitals, they were hemorrhaging money and have been hemorrhaging money for 10 weeks. So what's the societal harm? And maybe your business is okay, but your coworkers, your employees, and your family can't get timely access to care.
So there's three-word thing: societal blast radius. We talk about internally in an IR, lateral movement, and internal blast radius. Think about societal blast radius. We're going to talk you through. Josh just mentioned Change Healthcare. We're going to talk you through a couple of these attacks and real-life examples that if you want to go communicate to others in your organization, these disruptions are against private sector organizations are impacting societal, are causing societal harm. And so thinking about that societal blast radius of what can happen to a single organization, again, it illustrates the connected nature of this and is really key.
So because the trust we built with Eye on the Cavalry did a lot of stuff with healthcare when the pandemic was declared or starting to be declared at RSA conference in 2020. I was talking to Chris Krebs, the first director of CISA, and we were kind of hoping this thing would blow over. We were hoping it wasn't bad, but I kind of warned him, if this gets bad, I expect a large volume and variety of adversaries to disrupt U.S. hospitals and supply chains. I hope I'm wrong. But if that happens, I'd like to brief your team on everything. I know, because we did a congressional task force report, and we pulled some punches. Like, we said a lot of hard stuff, but we held some back. And of course, a couple weeks later, he calls for that briefing and says, hey, I don't want the briefing. How'd you like to come serve your country for a year? And I took a big gulp, but I got recruited in under Emergency Hiring Authority to design and implement what became the CISA COVID Task Force. So we were actually looking at basic human needs throughout the pandemic with supply chain disruptions, both on U.S. hospitals and their supplies, but also on Operation Warp Speed, which was the race to design and develop vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics to keep our families alive. Maslow never actually used a pyramid, apparently, but it's a good model. In fact, the deputy for the CISA COVID Task Force just walked in, national treasure. But the thing is, like, if you understand social contract theory, Thomas Hobbes said state of nature is a state of war, nasty, brutish, and short. We're animals, and we would kill each other in our sleep to steal each other's coconuts if we had want and insecurity at the bottom of our basic human needs like water, food, shelter, safety. So we can invent iPhones, we can write poetry, we can make movies when we feel safe and secure at the bottom levels, but if you have a shock to the system, like a death in the family, a cancer diagnosis, riots in your hometown, We're 24, 48 hours from Lord of the Flies. So if you hadn't noticed, at different points, especially during the pandemic, many people were operating at basic sustenance levels. So think about the things that are too time sensitive and latency sensitive to fail, because not all critical infrastructure is the same. Now, while I was ostensibly there to protect the nation's hospitals and vaccine supplies, while I was there, we had successful cyber disruption of the water you drink, of the food you put on your table, of the oil and gas pipelines on the eastern seaboard that fuel your cars, your homes, and your supply chains, of municipal electrical grids that power your cities and your schools, of the schools your children attend, of federal agencies charged with national security, and most troublesome, of timely access to patient care with now proven mortal consequences. We've now proven, we already knew that delayed integrated care affects mortality rates, and now we've proven that these ransoms delay care sufficient to drive those excess deaths. We're not in Kansas anymore. We are messing with Maslow. One of the ways we tried to break this down for healthcare providers, I'll do it very quickly, is whether you're a health delivery organization, HHS, we want to keep people alive. Well, how do you keep people alive in their love language? Well, you need carrying capacity where people need it. Well, what's carrying capacity? It's the 3 S's. Did you see the cybersecurity gun? I don't. But if you give them more money, they're like, we're not going to spend money on cybersecurity. We're going to spend money on one of the 3 S's. So if you have 100 beds, you don't have 100 beds of capacity if you only have 80 staff beds. You don't have 80 beds of capacity if you only have supplies for 60 of those 80 staff beds. So they're solving for the constraint at all times. So we had to try to express to them in their own love language how this works. So the first thing I did is when we started to see at the 1-year mark of the pandemic, when we had lost 500,000 Americans to COVID, mostly 85-year-olds, but a lot of people, we had also lost 150,000 Americans on top of that to non-COVID excess deaths. And unlike the COVID deaths, these were younger people. The fastest growing demographic were 25 to 44-year-olds. And because of the work we had done with I Am the Cavalry and the hospitals and the FDA, we suspected, I'll bet you these are time-sensitive conditions where minutes or hours matter. So with heart, a 4.4 minute delay in an ambulance ride studied by the New England Journal of Medicine shows an elevated mortality rate for heart attacks. 1, 3, or 4 hours are the golden hours for stroke, where time is brain. And if you don't get timely care on heart and brain, you're going to have significantly elevated loss of life for young people. And that's exactly what was happening. So we tried to mix their model and said, don't just try to care for people, pay attention to the latency sensitivity. The second thing we pointed out is medical technology is a force multiplier of staff. If you have a neonatal intensive care unit nurse in 1990, she can handle 1 baby safely in an acute condition. But armed with modern technology and nursing stations and more than a dozen pieces of equipment, they can now sit at a desk and look at 5, 10, 15 babies concurrently. So if technology is a force multiplier, the unavailability of that technology is a force divider. And when it shuts down, that safe, sane patient to caregiver ratio is thrown off and people die. And that's exactly what happened. On October 1st of 2021, the front page of the Wall Street Journal revealed an ongoing court case of a 2019 virus ransomware of a hospital in Alabama with the first named victim of that encounter. So the baby was admitted to a ransomed hospital. They didn't change how many patients they were admitting. It was a complex birth without imaging. They did not have the ability to see that the baby had an umbilical cord wrapped around their neck. And while the the birthing process was successful, the baby subsequently perished in post-birth complications, and but for the text messages between doctors and nurses admitting that they never should have admitted, or that they wouldn't have lost the baby if they had their equipment, it started to really punctuate that in these environments, you have a dozen or more hyper-connected technologies that we have become dependent upon, and when we can't use them in the delivery of care, the patient's ultimately the one affected. On the same day, my team, not coordinated, we published the first statistical proof of loss of life in a paper called Provide Medical Care as in Critical Condition. And it's complicated data science, but we actually did peer-reviewed medical journal data science to show stress levels associated with excess deaths 2, 4, and 6 weeks later. And that curve basically shows that if you go over 75% saturation of your ICU bed units across the country, we would see 18,000 dead Americans in 2 weeks. And if you got to 100% saturation, it was 80,000 dead Americans in 2 weeks. Again, younger people from preventable, time-sensitive care. Armed with this instrument to measure strain associated with excess deaths, we looked at the state of Vermont hit hardest by a ransom attack near the 2020 election. And with this, in the same state, with the same pandemic conditions, the same population, adjusting for hospital type and size, we could isolate that the affected communities achieved these stress levels sooner and stayed there longer than their peers, measuring minimum, maximum, most likely excess deaths attributed to this. We thought there were two ways to die. Number one is if you ever hear, no patient care has been affected, it's immediately followed by a line that negates that, which is, we are diverting ambulances to the next proximal alternative care. If that is further than 4.4 minutes, at scale, you'll start to see more mortality rates for heart, and if it's further than an hour or 3, you'll see it for stroke. And some people had to go 2 states away to get care. But the real death count was category 3, where it drove saturation in the blast radius. The overflow to other hospitals put them into dangerous levels associated with excess deaths. Turns out there's 2 more ways to die, but we'll touch on that. Here you go. Just as I thought we were on a good path, and we had Congress and the White House aligned to do a better job at raising the minimum standards for the hospitals that you care about, Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital got hacked in 2016. It was the first accidental ransom from SamSam. And after that, ransoms targeted healthcare specifically, and it's been the #1 target since February 2016. But this particular one was the first hospital ever to close and cite their ransom was a contributing cause of their death. Now, 1 or 2 hospitals closing, if they're just not financially sound, maybe you wouldn't think it's a big deal, but this was a gut punch to me because these smaller, medium rural hospitals have maybe 4 to 6 weeks cash flow on hand in reserve, and a ransom can knock you down for 6 to 12. So every ransom every year is a chance to roll the dice, and you're either gonna close your doors or be the victim of a predatory acquisition and mothball. Now, this is a map of the US. And when I first did the Congressional Task Force in 2017, we had 7,000 US hospitals. Now when you hear the government, they talk about 6,000. Every one of those dots is a closure. So if you think being down for 6 weeks is dangerous for elevated excess deaths, what about being down forever? And huge chunks of the continental US are losing their ability to have a hospital at all. And this is before the Change Healthcare. So if you close your doors, you cannot serve the community, and people that have time-sensitive conditions where minutes or hours is the difference if you walk or talk again, it's not a good situation.
Yeah, and so we've obviously Josh just took a really critical deep dive on care at hospitals. This isn't just hospitals. There are universities and schools that have gone out of business due to these issues that we've seen the ability for key things that serve our country that fail again. An hour without water doesn't just keep hospitals from operating. Manufacturing, there's so many things that are reliant on this infrastructure. I think Josh's comment that with a day without power and water, and we're back to Lord of the Flies. And so this is closure, this is degraded care, this is loss of life. So where this originated from is Josh and I presented actually, I can't believe, 12 years ago at their RSA conference in adversary model. And this came from, we were frustrated that this was, that someone would have an attack, drop a text file that said we are Legion. We're like, oh, it must be anonymous. And we looked through and looked at there's a variety of actor classes that you deal with. They have motivations, they have target assets, they have impacts they're trying to make, and then they have methods. And we looked at how do you take these and connect them for an adversary class. And interestingly, we missed ransomware. That wasn't a conversation 12 years ago. But when you look, we have methods of either exfiltrating data for ransom or malware to encrypt it, affecting confidentiality or availability. But when you go to the top, we see a number of different actor classes using these same methods. And so I think one of the things that's very important is, some of these attacks we'll get into, we're gonna talk about some of the conflicts going on in the world right now, are nation state activity. But some that are financial actors, some of it is accidental, and that these outcomes are impacting our society. I think when we talk about nation states, that if you take a state actor, we think, you may think of China originally with industrial espionage. But we have North Korea, who is funding their nuclear weapons program that now has missiles that can reach the entire continental United States based on financing that program through ransomware and Bitcoin theft, cryptocurrency theft, finance those programs. So we see a ton of different ways that these actors can make impact. And if this topic interests you, actually the original slides are still available that we've walked through the models. There's baseball cards that talk through each of the different actors. But it's very important to understand with who we're up against and their methods and motivations, because that actually informs, the idea of this was, if you think this entire game is in play, it is really hard to prioritize what to do next. when you look at the risks, particular risk inside of it, we'll dive into some of these, you now can get into the point where you can make some prioritization decisions. So what I want to do is quickly walk you through, I think that we've mentioned some of these already, but as you leave the room and you go to, talk to others in your organizations or, in industry groups or in society about these things, we'll talk about, the real life impact. So Colonial Pipeline, obviously, you have fuel shortages, but what actually happened was, beyond the fuel shortages, this drove up fuel prices globally. Like panic buying, drove up fuel prices. And so this panic buying that came from this, it wasn't just a fuel supply problem, it was also an economic problem. So these things are impacting our society. The target of this was Ukraine, and it caused billions of dollars of damages in the commercial sector. But again, those make great Wall Street Journal headlines. Look underneath the covers. Merck can't make drugs. I bet, over half the people in this room probably have taken a medication that Merck either sold or created originally as a key piece of their medical care. People couldn't ship commercial goods. That the ability for boats couldn't operate that were key to our shipping. So while this had millions of dollars of financial impact, the second bullet is the thing they take away. And again, they were not the target. This was in a connected world. The target in Ukraine, this leaked into the broader area, and again drove that's not just U.S. societal impact, global societal impact from these attacks. And I think Change Healthcare is the one that we'd already decided to do this talk, but really hit home for me. I haven't talked to Change in the room, but I don't think that Change likely realized how critical that they were. 94% of U.S. hospitals surveyed were impacted, their cash flows were impacted because of this attack. 94%. So these are areas where, frankly, I'm not sure the adversaries knew that how great of a target they had either. But I think if we don't take this as a learning lesson of, again, people losing $100 million revenue a day, when you talk about 6 weeks of cash on hand, this is, there are doctors, I was talking with a private equity firm who bought up a bunch of dental offices, and they're going to have dental offices go out of business because of Change Healthcare.
And private pharmacies and small, medium healthcare.
Yeah, just brutal. So these are really, so if you're talking back at home and folks are like, oh, this isn't that big of a deal. Like these are examples where, an attack on a single private sector organization is impacting, global society and other organizations.
And we don't have a slide for this, but there's a term of art that you may hear, and I'm hoping you're going to hear more, called SICI, or Systemically Important Critical Infrastructure, or Systemically Important Entity, SIE. This is something that day one was supposed to be present at CISA, and it was supposed to be in collaboration with each of the 16 sector leaders for the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, so HHS for healthcare, EPA for water and wastewater, DOE for energy. The notion here is in any given critical infrastructure sector, there's a handful of entities that play an outsized role in harm to the sector. Change, we found out after the fact, is a SICI. And what I said is if we don't stop making excuses and hand-wringing and looking at the sky and looking at our shoes and saying no one wants to be on a list, if we don't proactively identify our systemically important critical infrastructure, our adversaries will reveal them to us while we burn. The harm is palpable and amplified by this being a market consolidation is typically a good thing for private interests, but unsound market consolidation drives unsound risk concentration, where more eggs in fewer baskets means this one attack on one entity hurt the whole country's capacity. We have 750 ransoms on US hospitals per year, which is 750 times to roll the dice and either go out of business or get acquired. This one attack hit all of them at the same time. So if you hear SICI and you don't like it, please push past your discomfort and demand that we identify those systemically important entities. I'm tired of excuses.
And we actually give you some tools to think about this for your organization as we wrap. So I think the other piece is like we talk about war or potential future wars. A lot of folks are like, that's an easy problem. Like, hey, that's not happening today, or that's not happening in our area. And it's an easy problem to put away and not think about. And I think we can't. And we're going to talk through that. Obviously, China, they're a very active cyber player that has moved from what was obviously a very large focus on industrial espionage to a global, securing infrastructure globally to be able to take out acts of war and to reduce other countries' ability to control their ambitions in other areas of the world.
And look, we are not saber rattling. And cyber war used to be a nauseating thing we would make fun of. But one of our discussant leaders tomorrow is Rob Kanacki. He's the one that drove most of the Office of National Cyber Director for the White House, the president's strategy, 5 pillars. And we were on a panel yesterday at an investor event, and he said, when he wrote a book on cyber war, Wired Magazine's description of it was file this under fiction. And now pretty much everything he talked about is happening in that book. And the White House is being very forthright with you. We're just not listening. And Anthony Blinken on stage and the State Department guy went to China, and they just said, you're in violation of our agreements on this. And when we were at RSA talking about industrial espionage or nation-state espionage, a lot of people groaned at this conference. But like one of the nice things, if you know that Maya Angelou quote of, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. China is very consistent about telling what they're going to do, doing what they're going to do, and then we say, we didn't know they were going to do that. And they have been saying they intend to take Taiwan as early as 2027, and they intend to rain chaos on US soil, on critical infrastructure, to keep the US out of the fight. So, but Rob said it better than that. Yesterday, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but he said, does anybody think if we have a war with Iran, with Russia, with China, that it will not be a hybrid conflict at this point? Do you think that we're not going to use the arsenal there if we're in an active war already? So don't think that someone's going to be stupid enough to accidentally declare an active war by hitting designated critical infrastructure. But if we have a hot conflict, it will absolutely include on-prem. And I think we have a link to it later, but the 4 horsemen of the cyber defense apocalypse for the US have told Congress in unclassified hearings in January about Volt Typhoon. And you've probably heard Volt Typhoon, but it's just one of those many action figures you can collect at a booth if you go to the booth later. But Volt Typhoon specifically we were calling it pre-positioning. Pre-positioning. So they have been in some critical infrastructure for as least 5 years, and we found and evicted them from some things like water and wastewater utilities. But most of these target-rich cyber-poor environments are poorly instrumented and would not have the capability of the team to notice that they've been compromised. And the idea is to flip a switch and not extract a ransom, but maybe do cyber-physical damage to water, to wastewater, to electrical.
Yeah, I think, again, the China-Taiwan conversation is a really important topic for a number of reasons. So one is, this conversation is likely happening if you're in a large organization in your C-suite. That a couple years ago, people were like, oh, China, economic thing, we trade so much, we'll never have war. And now, you took Davos, that there's conversations of we are over-dependent on China, that folks are both economic concerns, political concerns, geopolitical concerns, military concerns, that boards are asking, what is your risk in China and how are you able to diversify those? And so, but I think what's also really fascinating, chat, is that, so it's not, they've said, you hear 2027, China has not said we're going to invade Taiwan in 2027. The US intelligence shows that Xi Jinping has said his military needs to be ready to do this in 2027. Dmitry Alperovich said it's likely a 2027 to 2035 window where this can occur. But again, China is a unique entity if you're not into public policy, that they write 5-year statements. And they don't always do exactly what they'll say, but they tell the world what their plans are. And they have telegraphed this, and I think for me what's critical is that our cyber resilience as a private sector is critical to deterrence in these areas. And so the government is at a point now where inflecting China's ability or inability to do this is reliant on our wastewater treatment plant security, our healthcare, our privately run healthcare security, which is a place we've never found ourselves the way we do today. I mean, perhaps in T-Trade years ago, but it's a connected place that we have some serious challenges and not a great book to work from. But there's some good news is, again, we have 3 years to prepare for this. This is not this isn't, again, COVID and we're trying to do and, people are dying. Like, we have 3 years before this is ready. And again, so there's a lot of potential for methods to to deter China from taking these actions. A lot of those exist outside of this conference in this room, military, trade, diplomatic, other areas. But again, our cyber resilience, both in the public and private sector, are a key deterrence method for this.
Luckily, it's just China we have to worry about, right? But we do have, conflicts that we're being baited into participating in and could tip at any given moment. So whether it's the unpleasantness in Ukraine, whether it's the situation in Gaza pulling in Iran, there was a weekend where you saw the stock market drop very quickly because people were very concerned that we were going to end up having some hot conflict with Iran again. Whether these are the kind of wars we're used to seeing or not, or they're skirmishes, cyber is a domain of war now. So we may not have as long as 3 years. So when we say 3 years plus or minus, maybe Taiwan's later, maybe this happens with Iran sooner. So speaking of which, we'll give you just a tiny thumbnail so we can get to some of the other content.
Yeah, so I guess why don't we just flip through these rest? Yeah, that again, we have the old axis of evil that are very active in cyber. Again, some great Copilot generated imagery. If you need things for your presentations, feel free to take them.
Of course, we had to use some AI. Right?
But Iran, North Korea, that this just isn't about China. And so I think one of the things that frustrates me is we're like, well, China might not invade Taiwan. Why do we think about this? We have active wars in the Ukraine and Gaza that have already illustrated their interconnected nature on the global economy and global society. And so this is real today.
So if you haven't heard this book or read this book, this is now mandatory reading at West Point. This is every single military leader in the US and allies have read this book. Peter W. Singer and August Cole. It's the fictionalized novel, The Next War. And you're reading it, like, this would never happen. This would never happen. Oh my God, this would totally happen. Oh my God, this would totally happen. And it's just a slow-moving train wreck of how arrogant and negligent we've become. They've since written another book. I befriended August around the same time as Max Brooks, Mel Brooks' son, who wrote World War Z, not the terrible movie that he hates, but the amazing book, which is the after-action report from the UN after a zombie war, a zombie apocalypse. And he wrote it in the wake of 9/11 after quitting Saturday Night Live because he was supposed to use comedy to help us cope with the tragedy of 9/11, and no one in New York would let him do it. So he had to write fiction. So what they shared in common with Gaiman and others is sometimes the best way to tell the truth is through fiction. If you haven't seen Leave the World Behind on Netflix, it's pretty decent. Sam Esmail from Mr. Robot fame. But what's really interesting, besides the scenarios that Cavalry has run in public scenarios before, is it's the first and only movie executive produced by the Obamas. Why did they choose that movie as a soft warning through fiction? Anybody remember The Fall of Rome? Nero playing, fiddle while Rome's burning? The Visigoths did not come into Rome Central with all the gladiators like Russell Crowe and do hand-to-hand combat. They sacked Rome by sacking the aqueducts, the least guarded, federated, weak points. No water, no civilization.
So anyone know, is that a black rhino or a white rhino? So it turns out that there are black rhinos and white rhinos. They're all actually gray, if you're into zoology. So we can't wait until the rhino charges. That if we're at this point, it's too late. So we've had a lot of talks at the RSA conference about black swans. Black swans piss me off.
What is a black swan?
So a black swan is an event that in theory is unpredictable because it has a low probability of occurring. And I think what you'll find, and Michelle Walker is a researcher in the mainly financial markets who coined the term gray rhinos, because again, they all appear gray, and it akin to the elephant in the room. That many of these events, the Trump administration said that we were not prepared for a global pandemic and things we had to do, and that there were risks of those things. When you look at the financial events that occur in markets, there are signs, and we often just misignore them. And so Michelle Walker coined gray rhinos, that these are events that have a high probability of occurrence that can be prepared for protective measures, but societally we tend to ignore them. And so the sort of like talking to the elephant in the room, the gray rhino is her response to to the black swan. And so what I'd argue is that if someone says these things aren't possible, or we don't know, or these may be black swan events and we can't prepare, the evidence we've shown illustrates that these are known likely events and they're things that we can do about. And so the shift actually started about what can we take and do?
Okay, so this is not going to be satisfying. It's going to come fast. We're going to do two more things in record time. One of them is constraints can be valuable, so don't become overwhelmed at 3 years sounds like too little. We've done more in less time. But then we're also going to talk about 4 or 5 assumptions that we should smash if you brought them to your day job, especially talk to a lot of risk professionals in the room and GRC people. We're going to smash some assumptions, we hope. So some of the crucibles, you remember Apollo 13, we were going to lose these astronauts, right? We had an issue. The only available solutions are on board, and while these are our famous actors, this is actually one of the astronauts using the onboard equipment to maybe somehow save the lives of these astronauts. So where there's a will, there's a way. Necessity is the mother of invention. Similarly, my first job out of college was working on Y2K, which some of you think never happened. Oh, it happened. But we had a national coordinated prioritization scheme to say which systems might cease working, but not just cease working, have societal harm if they cease working. We had a finite number of COBOL programmers, and at least 80% of the stuff my software company worked on, we knew would probably not actually hurt anybody, but 20% would, and the art form was knowing which 20%. So in an abundance of caution, we had to do our stuff, and largely working backwards from a known cliff, we were able to do quite a bit and avert that crisis.
And so I Inspire, I think that 2027 is an opportunity for a cybersecurity Y2K event, that we have a declared action from China that will occur at some point, and we have a societal impact, and we have common good to address that. And so what I call is how do we make this the cybersecurity Y2K?
We have 10 minutes.
Yep.
So this is part of a much longer conversation, but from some after actions we did from the Cisco COVID task force, one of the things that kept me up at night was we had actually invented the first vaccines from Pfizer. We had to keep cold things impossibly cold. And all of a sudden we realized, oh my God, we have no way to keep them cold. We didn't have enough ultra cold refrigerators for the temperatures they needed. So we had to use dry ice. And while dry ice is imminently producible, if you have CO2, as soon as we realized no one was driving the US and CO2 was a byproduct of enrichment for fuel, we had no CO2 for beer, we had no CO2 for dry ice, and we had a nationwide scramble to make sure we can keep cold things impossibly cold for something that every day of the year it's easy to make. During a pandemic, with the right little disruptions to things you always take for granted, we almost didn't have enough. Similarly, we started to realize that the way that the federal government manages critical infrastructure with 16 silos that don't like to cooperate with each other kills people. Because while you might think HHS should be responsible for hospitals because it's healthcare and public health, if you shut off the water, there is no hospital. You don't even have to hack the hospital to hurt US hospitals. You just gotta shut off the water in that town. There's no surgeries, there's no drinking water for patients, there's no chemical, you can't do your laboratory tests. So these are incredibly hyper-connected and interconnected, and that's not how we approach our leadership. And what we started to show was out of all the critical infrastructure sectors, when everything's critical, nothing's critical, and we mapped things to Maslow's hierarchy, and of 55 things called national critical functions, about a dozen of them are so time sensitive and life sensitive that if you shut them off for 24 to 48 hours, people die. And these dozen are things like water, electricity, emergency care, and not only are they the least protected of our critical infrastructure, they're inherently cross-sector. So the only way to really do this is treating this like a JSOC or a special forces team instead of silos. So one of the punchlines of that longer talk, which we recorded here last year in the sandbox, is that when everything's critical, nothing's critical. There's about 10 to 12 plus or minus super life-sensitive things. They're inherently cross-sector, which necessitates that CISA gets its act together and does this, and I'm a pro-CISA guy, but that also means that its siblings need to let it. So there's been a little bit of reluctance for CISA to step up, and there's been a lot of pushback from the interagency to let them collaborate on this. And in the meantime, the cavalry isn't coming yet again. So if you don't help identify the things that, if they're shut off, would be vital to disruption of your business or your community, if we aren't starting to flag these systemically important critical infrastructures, our adversaries will keep doing it. So the key term of art for what I had to do with my constraints, we called it target rich but cyber poor. If you like Wendy Nather, she had the whole security poverty line. 85% of the owners and operators for these lifeline critical infrastructure sectors don't have a single cybersecurity person on staff, not even one person. They can't do zero trust. They can't do best practices. They can't do almost anything. So my adaptation, and I screamed at a lot of CISA people, and a lot of them took it, and a lot of them have been very brave to push this. And you hear this term often, what can you do if you only have 3 months for someone with no security program? You want to just throw your hands in the air, or can you do stuff? So part of what we did is I said, screw best practices. Let's document the bad practices. And Don Benak and I gave a talk at RSA 2 years ago on this. There were 3 things that were the most dangerous things we saw in critical infrastructure. So for the love of God, please make sure you don't have end-of-life unsupported operating systems naked on the internet in service of critical infrastructure. Hard-coded passwords, like we saw in water facilities. A password of 1111 is how the Iranian hacking group disrupted US water facilities. 1111, a bad practice. Then we said, okay, well that's not enough. Your assets are showing. Can you get your shit off Shodan or your stuff off search? Because I couldn't say shit or Shodan on a government paper. And that'll give you the ability to say what assets are showing on the internet, take off the ones you don't need, harden the ones you do. Well, what does that mean? Well, why don't you do a free nightly scan from CISA's cyber hygiene program that'll tell you all the vulnerabilities? Well, we can't possibly fix all these vulnerabilities. Fine, fix the KEVs, the known exploited vulnerabilities. So we said, avoid the bad practices, get your shit off Shodan. For the stuff that has to be there, get a nightly scan, fix the known exploited vulnerabilities. And then the White House liked that, and they said, okay, no one's doing the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's been around for 11 years. They're volunteering to ignore the voluntary framework. So they tasked CISA to build on the bad practices with CPGs, which are the cross-sector cyber performance goals. It's the crawl stage of crawl, walk, run. It's the foundational stuff like asset inventory. Okay, so they said to the regulators, if you have regulatory authorities with unused or underutilized regulatory powers, use them now. And start with the CISA cyber performance goals of these 38 baselines. And because you're all beautiful, unique snowflakes, you should add your own sector specific to those. But just like any snowflake, you all have the same melting point. So do these CPGs first. And then things like SBOM came through.
All right, so Josh is a big lover of Haiku, and which I've had to learn to write in our partnership. But you know, of Josh's, I want to pick that we must mess with these: food, water, power, healthcare, less Lord of the Flies.
Oh, it's a typo. I think it was supposed to say mustn't mess with these. Darn it. Okay. My favorite one of his was written by a computer. Yeah, so Copilot fed on these slides, wrote, silent bites invade, society's trust erodes, chaos and silence. But Haiku is very constrained, and you can make really epic poetry even though we did not. All right, so we told you, we promised you we'd tantalize you, especially to provoke you to come get some good answers and solutions at the workshop on Wednesday. Let's challenge some assumptions. I hinted that I took 5 hackers into Fort Meade to challenge assumptions before the formation of the cavalry. But draw your eyes not just to David as Hawkeye, but the late, great Dan Kaminsky as the Hulk who smashes things. And of the many contributions that Dan Kaminsky has made to this space, he said, of all the things hackers destroy and smash, perhaps the most important is assumptions. And he was the king. We've learned a lot, and we miss him a lot.
So assumption 1, we're insured. First of all, if you haven't read your insurance policies or talked to your attorneys, they all have an active war provision inside of them that prevents them from paying. Merck, I will say, well, Merck sued and won and not paid. Yeah. If you're suing your insurance company, things have failed. And so they may be recovered, but it's not just that, it's also being underinsured. This is not a cyber example. This is not some conspiracy theory. Just was in the news. The Baltimore Bridge that collapsed. It's going to be over $1 billion in damage. They had a $350 million insurance policy. And so insurance is great. It is a great way of transferring risk. We can't transfer all our risk. Second, our BCDR plan for this. I don't know a single organization who ran China getting a hold of critical infrastructure for acts of war in their BCDR planning. So we have to think differently about these areas. Very connected to that. The other one is our backups make us resilient. Is anyone familiar with the original Aurora attacks?
Not the Google Aurora.
Not the Google ones, but the original Aurora attacks. So Idaho National Labs took a generator. This is 2007, 17 years ago. And they took a generator and they powered it up and they hacked it. And you can go watch the video and you see it start to shake. It caused the generator to explode. I don't care how many backups you have of the industrial control system. When your generator blows up, people die. and you don't keep spare generators around. You know, the time to get a new generator is the time to install it. That backups don't solve this problem. Again, backups are really important as a first stage of resilience and ransomware. They don't solve these issues.
Yeah, so perhaps you think if we have the John Deere harvesters on harvest day of a key crop, we'll just get a replacement sent to us. But when all of them are bricked at the same time, there aren't enough replacement parts and or technicians. And if it's a water and wastewater valve and they're all turned up to high pressure and can't get repaired, we could be down for months, not weeks, months. Oops.
And this one fascinated me. Joshua channel about this in COVID is that that hospitals, all had backup plans for latex nitrile gloves. Turned out that 3 or 4 hospitals all used the same backup supplier in Malaysia. And so, the interconnected nature of this, when you think about, we talk about supply chain attacks and things like SolarWinds, we don't think about, a particular internet backbone or a cloud provider that we're using as a backup that likely everyone else is too. And so our resilience in our supply chains is critical.
Yeah, most medical suppliers had very robust resilience on paper with alternative suppliers. It's just that every one of their alternative suppliers use the same root suppliers. So back to the why so serious. People should not be messing with our hospitals, right? And if we're going to do a little bit of exercise on this to make it really personal if you come on Wednesday.
Got 5.
Okay. So we're not going to rehash this, but like when I said we did data science, this is the report. It was backed by a CDC Morbidity and Mortality Weekly report that was peer-reviewed medical journal. But we essentially looked at the various qualitative and quantitative impacts when we had some of those supply chains or disruptions done in real time. There are worse scenarios, and we've increasingly been encouraging crisis simulations. And CISA, if you're in critical infrastructure, has free tabletop crisis simulations. Some of them are self-service, some of them are more robust. But like, I guarantee you, whatever tabletops you've done have not had a downtime recovery window of weeks or months. You might be able to handle 2 or 3 days without water, but even if your buildings can handle it, can your employees' families handle it? And we just have to take whatever your assumptions are and take them from maybe a day, a week, to maybe a month or longer.
So what can we do? So I think, again, one of the key takeaways is, the U.S. and really global public and private sector cyber resilience are critical to both national security. So if you take this from a citizen and wanting to support our country, there's that. But it's also our key societal functions. So again, selfish. If you're at the bottom of the Maslow's hierarchy, it is not good. We have a wide variety of responses from governments at the federal, state, local levels, international consortiums. But we should assume the cavalry's not coming. That again, you are the cavalry. And so how do we take this and actually go take some critical action? So here's again the workshop tomorrow. That this is a teaser. This was the movie trailer. That we're going to spend 3 hours tomorrow working with some key folks and in a workshop format where we can dive into these problems and come up with more ideas and solutions around how we think through these.
Yeah, this includes Rob Kanaki from the White House, who wrote most of this president's strategy, some former NSA people, a woman who identified that all the cranes and all the ports in the U.S. are running Chinese software and beaconing back to China, people from the INL. So we have some serious players who want to help you get serious in some provocations and discussion tomorrow. So that's the room, Moscone South 301. And if you have friends or colleagues that don't have a badge, we designed this so you only need an Expo badge. So it's first come, first serve. Let's, if this struck a chord in your heart, please come and be part of the solution.
And then I'll bring us home here with some things that you can also take home. So, General Omar Bradley was a critical general and strategist in World War II, and a great quote that said, "Amateurs talk about tactics, professionals study logistics." So we talk about the interconnected nature of this. We not only understand, how does our, a system or our organization fit into these, but how does this connect more broadly? I think, one of the things I would challenge is I think we need to come up with. Does anyone know what the Waffle House Index is? Anyone from the Southeast? So, Waffle House is a pretty amazing organization that they've designed to be resilient to a number of failures and problems. And so they have a stoplight system, opening full menu, limited menu, forced to close, that FEMA said, if you get to a Waffle House that's closed, we're in a really bad place. And so what are those metrics that we can understand? And this is a tool we'll spend some time on tomorrow, but I wanted to do is again, understand where are you critical? The Change Healthcare conversation. Where in your organization, your customers, where can failures occur? Where do they impact from there through national security? and what timeframes come with that, and both understanding for your organization to your constituents or customers, and then the key suppliers that work with you. So I think what a very simple Excel spreadsheet can drive conversations at the leadership level that I think are really important to understanding these areas. So I love to cook, as does Josh. So I think mise en place, like you prepare before you cook. What are the things that we can do? What can we prepare for in a month, a quarter, a year, 3 years? What can we do alone and what can we do together? And so take Michelle Walker, who coined Gray Rhinos. I was writing a quote. I found hers that you can read. But we need to avoid succumbing to helplessness. Like, we can do things about this. These are hard problems. These are societal problems. But we have time and we can make an impact. And so what can we do as a business team, a community, a nation, and a planet to go impact these things? And that's what we want to inspire you to walk out of, to do both here today and the workshop tomorrow. And so how can you take this home? First of all, these are great cross-functional senior leadership conversations. They are having these conversations broadly, maybe not about cyber, but a chance to plug in. Take that Excel tool. How are you critical? And work on that. If you're not familiar with the Gray Rhino, it's a great book. There's also a podcast that the UDA group did with Michelle, that if you want the kind of Cliff Notes reading version, take that. And then again, build this cross-functional alignment. Let's go work on this together and be inspired and make some real impact. And so join us tomorrow, and thank you so much for your time today.